You used to wake up and within 30 minutes, without thought, planning, or effort, the bowel movement arrived. Predictable as the alarm clock and automatic as breathing. You never negotiated with it or managed it. The signal came, the body responded, and the morning moved on. Somewhere after 50, it stopped arriving on schedule. The urgency faded. The timing scattered across the morning, then across the day, then disappeared into something you had to actively manage rather than passively receive. The morning that required no thought became a negotiation with a body that seemed to have forgotten how the sequence worked. You added fiber, water, and the advice that arrives from every direction, the same advice given to everyone regardless of which specific system failed. Some mornings improved. Most produced no lasting change. The inconsistency was the most frustrating part because the interventions that worked on Tuesday failed on Thursday, with no variable you could identify changing between the 2 days. The inconsistency was the 5 independent systems failing at different rates on different mornings, each one sitting at a different point on its own independent decline curve, each one crossing and recrossing an individual threshold independently of the others, producing a pattern that looked random but was actually 5 separate decline curves overlapping on one outcome, each one invisible on its own, devastating in combination when they converge. The randomness was the clue, the signature of a multi-system problem masquerading as a single organ failure. On any given morning, 2 systems might cross their threshold while 3 fall short. The next morning, a different 2 cross while the different 3 fail. The bowel movement arrives on some mornings and vanishes on others through the same 5 systems sitting at different points on their individual curves, each one responding to slightly different overnight conditions of hydration, sleep quality, and meal timing. A single failing system produces consistent, predictable failure. 5 failing systems at different rates produce inconsistency. The very pattern you experienced, one assumption dominates. The colon slowed down. One organ, one decline, one problem. The assumption is understandable and incomplete. 5 systems converged on that single morning event, each one operating through different physics, each one degrading at a different rate after 50. And each one contributing a different component the bowel movement depended on. The nerve that triggers the signal weakened. The neurons that coordinate the wave thinned out. The water balance shifted against the stool. The angle of the tube kinked. The mechanical stimulus that assisted the wave disappeared when the morning walk stopped. You tried fiber supplements, more water, prune juice, magnesium, the advice the internet delivers in listicles that treat the colon as one organ with one problem. Some of it helped partially. None of it resolved the pattern because none of it addressed all 5 failures simultaneously. The morning bowel movement depends on 5 systems operating in concert, and restoring 1 or 2 while the other 3 remain degraded produces the partial, unreliable improvement that feels like progress without resolution. 5 systems, 5 independent failures. And the most surprising one has nothing to do with the colon at all. It has to do with a muscle you have never heard of that bends the exit at 90 degrees every time you sit on a modern toilet. Food entering the stomach triggers propulsive contractions in the colon. The signal is called the gastrocolic reflex, a communication between 2 organs separated by 6 meters of intestine connected through the vagus nerve. The stomach detects the arrival of food through stretch receptors in the gastric wall. The signal travels upward through vagal efferents to the brainstem, and the brainstem sends a motor command downward through vagal efferents to the smooth muscle of the colon. The colon contracts. Mass movement begins. The reflex is strongest in the morning, 30 to 60 minutes after the first meal, at the circadian peak of colonic motility, when the colon's own biological clock has primed the smooth muscle for its highest responsiveness of the day. At 30, the reflex fired reliably. Breakfast arrived, the vagus nerve carried the signal at full amplitude, the colon received a strong contraction command, and the morning bowel movement followed within the hour. The sequence ran without conscious involvement because the nerve carrying the signal had capacity to spare. You never thought about when to eat breakfast or whether to drink water first or how long to wait before leaving the house. The reflex managed its own timing because the nerve had margin. The margin disappeared so gradually that the loss presented as unpredictability rather than as a system running below its operating threshold. Vagal tone declines approximately 1% per year after 30. By 65, roughly 35% of peak vagal capacity is gone. the nerve still functions. The signal it carries has been getting quieter with each passing year. The colon receives a diluted instruction. The contraction that used to arrive forcefully and predictably now arrives weakly and intermittently. Some mornings the signal crosses the threshold and the reflex fires. Some mornings it falls short. The unpredictability you noticed after 50 is the reflex sitting at the border between firing and not firing, the weakened signal sometimes reaching the colon with enough amplitude to trigger mass movement and sometimes fading before it arrives. The mornings when the reflex fires feel like the old normal. The mornings when it fades feel like the body failed. Both mornings are the same nerve at the same capacity, the signal hovering at threshold, crossing on some mornings and falling short on others due to variations in hydration, sleep quality, stress, and meal timing that shift the threshold by fractions of a percent. What compensates for a nerve that lost a third of its capacity? The gastrocolic reflex depends on the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve passes through the stomach where a receptor sits that has not aged at all. The compensation the stomach discussion described in full operates here with identical physics. The cold receptor the stomach discussion described, TRPM8, fires when cold water contacts the gastric mucosa and amplifies the vagal signal through multimodal summation with the stretch receptors, producing a brainstem output disproportionately larger than either signal alone. The receptor rebuilds through normal cellular turnover on a timescale of days. At 65, TRPM8 is as responsive as it was at 30. A young receptor compensating for an old nerve, matching compensation physics that operates across every aging system, applied here to the specific reflex the bowel movement depends on. Well, the temperature determines which receptor fires. Anyone who reaches for warm coffee first thing in the morning is sending TRPV1 signals through the vagal pathway, the heat-sensing receptor that activates above 43 degrees. TRPV1 produces a vagal signal, but it does not produce comparable multimodal summation with the gastric stretch receptors that TRPM8 does. The cold channel and the stretch channel synergize. The heat channel and the stretch channel do not synergize at comparable amplitude. The temperature of the first liquid determines whether the brainstem receives a sum signal or two separate signals. And the difference after decades of vagal decline through a nerve running at roughly 2/3 capacity determines whether the gastrocolic reflex crosses the firing threshold or falls short. 300 to 500 milliliters of cold water, refrigerator temperature, before coffee, before food. The reflex receives the amplification the weakened nerve can no longer generate alone. The receptor that provides the amplification rebuilt itself last week through normal cell turnover and will rebuild again next week. The nerve declined across 35 years. The receptor regenerated across 5 days. A young receptor compensating for an old nerve. The trigger fires. Now the wave must carry it forward. Each timing carries its own physics. The gastrocolic reflex responds most strongly to the first gastric distension after the overnight fast. The stretch receptors in the stomach wall have been at resting baseline for 7 or 8 hours. The first distension they detect after that silence produces the largest afferent signal of the entire day. The stomach has been waiting for input. Cold water delivers 2 inputs through one nerve at once, arriving at the moment when the stretch receptors are most sensitive and the circadian clock has primed the colonic smooth muscle for its peak morning responsiveness. Cold water on an empty stomach also addresses an overnight accumulation the bowel depends on indirectly. Blood viscosity sits at its 24-hour maximum at waking. 300 to 500 milliliters of water lost overnight through breathing and evaporation have concentrated the blood. The colon responds to low systemic hydration by extracting water more aggressively from its contents, prioritizing blood volume over stool moisture. The cold water that fires TRPM8 simultaneously begins restoring systemic fluid levels through aquaporin channels in the intestinal epithelium, reaching the plasma within 15 to 20 minutes. One glass addressing 3 deficits: vagal amplification through TRPM8, gastrocoliac timing through stretch receptor sensitivity, and colonic hydration through systemic fluid restoration. Anyone who drinks warm water first thing receives the stretch signal alone. Anyone who drinks warm coffee receives TRPV1 activation and caffeine-mediated colonic stimulation, a pharmacological input rather than vagal amplification. Caffeine works through adenosine receptor blockade and direct smooth muscle stimulation. It bypasses the vagus nerve entirely. The bowel movement caffeine produces is a pharmacological override that bypasses the vagal amplification entirely. The dependency that develops, the morning that requires coffee to produce the movement it once produced spontaneously, is the body relying on a pharmacological bypass because the vagal reflex went unamplified by the receptor that could have restored it. The reflex is still there, the receptor is still there. The coffee masks both by routing around them entirely. The morning that starts with coffee and produces a bowel movement is pharmacology. The morning that starts with cold water and produces a bowel movement is the reflex operating through the nerve it was designed to use, amplified by a receptor the nerve was designed to receive. One creates dependency, while the other restores the pathway the nerve was built to carry. Cold receptor amplified the trigger signal. But what happens after the trigger fires? Each gastrocolic reflex triggers the colon to contract. But the contraction alone does not move the stool. A coordinated wave must propagate along the length of the colon, each segment contracting in precise sequence to produce directional propulsion. That coordination depends on the second nervous system you may not know you have, and it has been losing the neurons that run it. Inside the gut wall, the enteric nervous system contains 200 to 500 million neurons lining the gastrointestinal tract, a neural network so extensive it operates independently from the brain and is sometimes called the second brain. The peristaltic wave that moves stool through the colon requires two muscle layers working in precise coordination. Circular muscle contracts behind the bolus, squeezing the tube narrower to push the contents forward, while longitudinal muscle contracts ahead of the bolus, shortening the tube to prepare the next segment to receive the mass. The wave requires neuron-to-neuron timing measured in milliseconds. Each segment of colon must contract in sequence one after another, the way stadium spectators stand and sit in a wave that travels the length of the arena. At 30, every seat in the stadium was occupied. The wave propagated smoothly from ascending colon to sigmoid, each neuron firing its segment at the precise moment, the propulsive force continuous and unbroken. Enteric neuron density declines with age, as Safri documented in Neurogastroenterology and Motility. Fewer neurons coordinating the wave with each passing decade. By the sixth decade, sections of the stadium are empty. The wave still propagates, but gaps in the neural chain break the propulsive continuity. The stool moves forward through one segment, stalls where the neurons are sparse, moves again when the next populated segment fires, stalls again at the next gap. Transit time increases because the propulsive force is intermittent rather than continuous. Fragmentation is measurable. Colonic transit that completed in 12 to 24 hours, at 30 stretches to 36 to 48 hours in many older adults. The extended transit directly traceable to the reduced neuron density that coordinates the propulsive wave. Each segment of colon that lacks adequate neural input becomes a dead zone where the wave loses momentum. The circular muscle behind the bolus contracts weakly or not at all. The longitudinal muscle ahead fails to shorten. The stool sits in the dead zone until the next populated segment generates enough contraction to pull it forward. Anyone who describes the sensation as everything working fine for the first part of the process and then stalling is describing the wave reaching a dead zone. The propulsion that felt normal in the proximal colon, where neuron density may still be adequate, fails in the distal colon, where the neuron loss has progressed furthest. The wave carries the stool partway and then loses the coordination to carry it the rest of the distance. Transit time that should have been 12 hours becomes 36, and each additional hour in the colon means more water extracted from the stool through the colonic wall. The longer the stool sits in any segment, the more water that segment's epithelium extracts, and every additional hour the stool sits in the colonic epithelium extracts more water through osmotic diffusion. The colon's job is water recovery, pulling fluid from the intestinal contents back into the bloodstream. Efficient water recovery is the colon's design function. The longer the stool sits in contact with the colonic wall, the more water the wall extracts. Slower transit produces harder stool through the time-dependent absorption physics that operates in every diffusion system. The neuron loss drives the dehydration. Slower wave, harder stool, and the colon itself still functions, the inputs feeding it declined. The fragmented wave produces the extended transit that produces the hardened stool. Two consequences from one cause. If the wave fragmented and the stool hardened, why does straining against the problem produce so little result? Each nerve weakened, and the neurons thinned, and the transit slowed, and the stool hardened, and all of that still might have produced a manageable morning if the tube at the exit were straight. It has always been bent, and no one mentioned it. Puborectalis, a structure you have almost certainly never heard named, performing a function you have never been told about, creating a problem nobody connected to the difficulty you experience every morning. Puborectalis is a U-shaped sling of skeletal muscle originating from the pubic bone, wrapping around the junction where the rectum meets the anal canal like a horseshoe around a post. When the muscle contracts, which is its resting state whenever you are sitting or standing, it pulls the rectum forward toward the pubic bone and creates a kink at the anorectal junction of approximately 90 degrees. The rectum bends sharply forward. The anal canal angles sharply backward. The tube that stool must pass through makes a near right-angle turn at the exit. This kink is the body's primary continence mechanism. The bend in the tube prevents involuntary passage during standing, sitting, walking, coughing, sneezing, and every other activity that increases abdominal pressure. Without the puborectalis kink, maintaining continence during a cough or a sneeze would require constant, conscious sphincter contraction. The muscle solves a physics problem elegantly. Bend the tube and nothing passes through it regardless of the pressure above. During defecation, the puborectalis must relax. When it relaxes, the sling loosens, the rectum drops backward, and the anorectal angle opens from approximately the seated kink angle to approximately 126 degrees. The tube goes from kinked to nearly straight. The physics of the difference is dramatic. Pushing a viscoelastic mass through a 90-degree bend in a tube requires substantially more pressure than pushing identical mass through a tube that is nearly straight. The pressure difference follows from equivalent fluid dynamics that govern flow through any kinked pipe. Resistance increases exponentially as the bend angle tightens because the mass must deform around the bend and overcome the friction of contact with the outer wall of the curve. Here is the problem the modern toilet created. Sitting on a standard toilet positions the body with hips flexed to approximately the seated kink angle, feet flat on the floor, torso upright. In this position, the puborectalis remains partially contracted. The sling does not fully release. The anorectal angle stays at approximately the seated kink angle, the position of maximum resistance. The tube is still kinked. Every time you strain on a standard toilet, you are generating maximum abdominal pressure against a tube that is still bent at its tightest angle. Now consider what squatting does. Hips flexed beyond 100 degrees, knees above the hips, the thighs pressing against the abdomen. In this position, the puborectalis fully relaxes. The angle opens to the straightened angle as Takami and colleagues measured using defecographic MRI published in the journal Diseases of the Colon Rectum. The tube straightens and the pressure required to initiate passage drops. The mass that required straining against the seated kink angle passes with minimal effort through a nearly straight channel. The difference is geometry. The abdominal muscles generating the straining pressure are equivalent in both positions. The mass being moved is equivalent. The only variable that changed is the angle of the tube it must pass through. A 90-degree bend forces the viscoelastic mass to deform around the curve, pressing against the outer wall of the bend, generating friction that opposes the propulsive force. A straight tube eliminates the deformation, eliminates the friction against the outer wall, and allows the propulsive pressure to translate directly into movement. The physics corresponds to water through a bent drinking straw. Straighten the bend, and the flow resumes without sucking harder. The footstool straightens the bend. The amount of abdominal pressure required to initiate passage through a straight tube is a fraction of what the kinked tube demands, which is why the straining that characterized every morning on a standard toilet disappears when the knees rise above the hips. The abdominal muscles are generating less pressure because less pressure is needed because the resistance the pressure works against has dropped from the geometric maximum to something approaching the geometric minimum the squatting posture produces. The pressure you were already generating becomes sufficient because the resistance it was working against drops. Anyone who strained for 10 minutes on a standard toilet and then elevated the knees with a footstool for the first time describes that experience universally. The effort dropped to almost nothing. The mass moved through a channel that was suddenly open where it had been bent. The straining that felt necessary was the body compensating for a geometric problem the body could not solve from the inside. The footstool solves it from the outside. A footstool 15 to 20 centimeters high, placed in front of the toilet, elevates the knees above the hips and achieves approximately 80% of the angle correction full squatting produces. The puborectalis relaxes further, the anorectal angle widens, and the resistance drops. The difference between straining for 10 minutes against a kinked tube and passing with minimal effort through a straightened one is a $15 piece of equipment that changes the geometry of the exit. That data, the defecographic measurements showing the angle difference between standard sitting and elevated knee positioning, is why a footstool sits in front of my toilet now. The physics was too clean to ignore. That tube has always been bent. For decades, the assumption was that the colon failed, that the muscles weakened, that the diet was wrong, that aging simply made the process harder. The tube was bent at the seated kink angle by a muscle designed for continence, held in the bent position by a toilet designed for sitting, and no one mentioned the geometry because the geometry was invisible from the outside. The footstool straightens it. For 200,000 years of human evolution, defecation occurred in the squatting position. The puborectalis relaxed fully. The anorectal angle opened to 126 degrees. The tube was straight. The modern sit-down toilet arrived approximately 200 years ago and repositioned the body at the angle of maximum resistance for a process the body evolved to perform at minimum resistance. Every decade of toilet use trained you to strain against a physics problem that the toilet itself created. The effort you attributed to aging was partly aging, the enteric neurons declining, the vagal signal weakening, the transit extending. But the effort was also geometry, a 90-degree bend that no amount of dietary fiber or hydration or walking can straighten because the kink operates at the exit, downstream from every other intervention. The footstool is the only input in the entire morning sequence that addresses the geometry directly. The other 4 inputs optimize everything upstream. The footstool opens the gate at the end. 5 systems, 4 restored upstream, and 1 corrected at the exit. What determines whether the mass that reaches the straightened tube passes easily or requires effort? Upstream restored. Now the viscosity. 2 inputs modify the stool before it reaches the straightened tube, both operating through viscosity physics the channel has described in other contexts. Overnight, the body loses fluid through breathing and passive skin evaporation. The deficit the cold water began restoring. By morning, systemic hydration is at its daily minimum. The colon responds to systemic dehydration by extracting water more aggressively from its contents, prioritizing blood volume over stool moisture. The morning stool is the driest stool of the day because the colon pulled more water from it during the overnight hours when the body's hydration was lowest. The cold water that amplifies the gastrocolic reflex simultaneously addresses the hydration deficit, restoring systemic fluid levels and reducing the osmotic pressure that drives aggressive colonic water extraction. 1 input, 2 mechanisms operating through different physics on that morning event. Soluble fiber, beta-glucan from oats, pectin from fruit, inulin from onions and garlic, forms a hydrogel in the colon. The fiber molecules bind water into a gel matrix that holds moisture inside the stool, resisting the osmotic extraction the colonic epithelium performs. The gel physics applies here. Viscosity modification through molecular water binding applied to colonic contents, applied here to colonic contents. The hydrogel maintains stool moisture even when transit time extends beyond the design window. Without the gel, a stool sitting in the ascending colon for 36 hours loses enough water to become the hard, dry mass you recognize as the problem. With the gel, that stool retains enough moisture to pass through the straightened tube without the straining the kinked tube demanded. And then bacterial fermentation of the fiber in the colon produces butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that fuels the colonocytes lining the colonic wall and simultaneously stimulates propulsive colonic motility through direct activation of enteric neurons. The fiber feeds the wall that moves the stool. The fiber holds the water the wall would otherwise extract. The fiber fuels the neurons that coordinate the wave. 3 functions from 1 dietary input, each one addressing a different failure in the 5-mechanism chain. Can anything externally assist a wave that has lost its internal coordination? Walking produces rhythmic mechanical compression on the abdominal contents with every step. Each footfall creates a pressure oscillation that travels through the abdominal cavity and reaches the colonic wall, stimulating the enteric neurons that remain. The walking discussion described a related mechanical physics applied to arterial shear stress and lymphatic pumping. Applied to the colon, The rhythmic compression supplements the internal neural drive that has lost neurons with age. The fragmented peristaltic wave receives external mechanical assistance that fills the gaps the missing neurons left. The walk does for the colon what a pacemaker does for the heart. It provides an external rhythm when the internal rhythm has degraded. Well, the timing matters. Post-meal walking places the mechanical stimulus inside the window when the gastrocolic reflex has already initiated colonic contractions. The walk augments a peristaltic wave that is already propagating rather than trying to start away from mechanical input alone. 3 15-minute post-meal walks improve colonic transit time, as DiPietro confirmed in the diabetes care study that measured glucose control. The morning walk after breakfast serves the gastrocolic reflex through timing, the peristaltic wave through mechanical augmentation, and the glucose curve through GLUT4 interception simultaneously. The walk earns its value through timing rather than duration or intensity. 15 minutes at any pace placed inside the window when all three systems are most responsive outperforms 45 minutes at any other time of day because the glucose spike and the gastrocolic contraction both peak in that narrow postprandial window and both respond to muscle contraction through independent pathways. The walk that happens 60 minutes after breakfast catches the gastrocolic reflex at its peak amplitude and adds mechanical energy to a neural signal that is already fired. Sequence matters. Cold water first, because the TRPM8 signal and the gastrocolic reflex need the overnight stretch receptor sensitivity that food would reset. Breakfast second, within the circadian window when colonic motility peaks. Fiber at the breakfast table, because the hydrogel needs transit time to form before it reaches the colon. The footstool whenever the signal arrives, because the angle correction operates at the exit regardless of when the upstream input's fired, addressing the one failure that no dietary or timing intervention can reach, because the problem is geometric rather than biochemical. The walk after breakfast, because the mechanical augmentation operates at peak effectiveness inside the gastrocolic window that the first input already opened. 5 physics. 5 failures. 5 inputs that restore what time quietly took, and every one of them was in the first hour of the morning the whole time.